Erik, Chapter 7. I awoke in a comfortable but narrow bed in a humble room, but one with no bars on the door or window. A man that I thought I should recognize sat beside the bed, reading a book. "Are you a Jean, monsieur?" I asked, desperate to know. The man frowned, stood, and came over to where I lay. He laid a freezing cold hand on my brow, and his frown deepened. I felt myself slide back into sleep. Sometime later, I woke again. Someone had been calling out the name Miriam in anguished tones. Who was Miriam? And why wouldn't that voice stop yelling about her? Unconsciousness reclaimed me before I could find out. The third time I awoke, I thought I saw shifting bars around me on all sides. It was as if I turned on a rotating platform inside a tiny cage surrounded by laughing, mocking faces. I swung my fist at one of them, but hit nothing. The effort left me panting with fatigue and dripping with sweat, and I realized my body was about to give up on me and drop me back to sleep again. I remember feeling irritated that it was taking this long to wake up. Finally, I woke up feeling clear-headed. I looked at the man dozing on the chair beside my bed, and knew him to be Zara, the daroga, the chief of police. "What day is it?" I croaked. He woke with a start and stretched. "It has been 3 days since the test of your system." In his hesitation, I heard the rest of what he didn't say. It had been 3 days since I had dropped a ton of rock onto the woman I adored and crushed her to death. He continued, "The Shah is very excited about your system. He has already executed 5 men who opposed him. None of them escaped. He wishes to employ you permanently to create such systems for him." I sat up in the bed and considered. I no longer felt my life to be worth anything. I had shown cowardice in not allowing myself to be killed beside Miriam, saving my own skin while sacrificing hers. I felt that a torture engineer was just about as respectable a post as I could ever aspire to now. Since I'd selfishly decided I should keep on living, I needed a way to earn my living. A physician visited me. Zara remained to translate. The physician looked me over and gave the verdict that I had recovered, but that I should avoid such strong shocks of emotion in the future. I laughed cynically to myself as I remembered the shocks I had already endured in my life, none of which I had been able to avoid. I was soon back to full health. I met with the Shah to discuss our future arrangements. He wanted me to spend the rest of my life working for him. I refused, making him a counteroffer of 5 years instead. How many systems did one man need? I privately thought maybe he should look to mending some of his policies instead of seeking always to strike fear into his enemies. I didn't know the temperament of the average Persian citizen, but Miriam and I had read quite a bit about the French Revolution, and I could tell no Frenchman would stand for some of the things he did. Surprisingly, he agreed to my terms regarding the length of my employ. I had the lesson I'd learned from the Merrick brothers in my mind, and I insisted on getting his promise in writing. His clerk solemnly delivered me the parchment contract, stamped with the royal seal. I was given a little room in the new palace. It was comfortable enough, and good strong light fell onto my rosewood drafting table from the window. I had all the paper and ink I needed, with a comfortable cot in the corner. Each system blueprint I designed was rolled for storage and placed on a shelf. I constructed wooden models of some of them, too, and these greatly delighted the Shah when I took them before him to demonstrate. Even so, I had an enormous amount of leisure time. I spent at least an hour a day simply sketching whatever came into my head. One day, I began to sketch the outline of a veiled woman. I knew that I was trying to bring Miriam back to life by recreating her on paper. I worked on it until the paper nearly disintegrated, but I could not capture her likeness. The more I tried, the more my memory of her faded. Even winding up the music box and listening to the melody play was not sufficient to bring her lovely face back, at least not clearly enough that I could sketch it. I gave the idea up in disgust. I couldn't hide in my workspace all day long, however. All officials of the court, of which I now was one, were required to attend the Shah while he conducted the business of the nation. So I knelt in the throne room for countless hours, listening to problems I didn't care about, discussed in a language I still barely understood. As time passed, I understood better the wisdom of blending into the background, watching, learning, and listening. I prided myself on kneeling so still and quietly that even people who'd watched me enter the room forgot I was there. I found when the Shah forgot I was there, he was less likely to ask me questions in rapid-fire Persian. My halting, grammatically awkward answers in Persian always caused snickers among the men who had spoken it since birth. It was less injurious to my pride to make everyone believe I was not even present. My new fashion of dress helped with this. On the first occasion I was summoned to the court, I spent the time comparing myself with the other men in the room. The room was filled with noblemen and court officials, and they all carried themselves with breathtaking grandeur. I tried to match their self-important demeanor, and slowly I purchased clothing with my earnings to help me do so. I acquired a good cloak that could be swept aside as I bowed, and fine kid gloves that covered my work-roughened hands. I had a costumer who came to the court with a theater troupe create a selection of masks in white and black for me to cover my disfigurement. And I found a tailor to create a few fine suits for me in deepest black. I was coming to like that color very much, feeling it helped me escape people's notice. The black onyx ring that I still wore looked much more fitting with my new wardrobe than with the rough clothing I'd worn before. I still remembered my resolution to mistrust the people around me every time I glanced at the shining stone. My body filled out in a manly shape, which, while appreciated, came with the irritation of facial hair. At least, the curse of my deformity meant I had less to shave each day. The Persian fashion for men was to sport a painstakingly groomed mustache and beard, but my face would not grow the hair I needed to accomplish that, so I kept myself clean-shaven. The Shah, after being presented with each model of a torture system, would ask me to remodel it to remove one or two crucial elements, then display it on a shelf in the corner of the room near his throne. They served him as deterrents to those in the court that wished him harm. But they also served me as advertising for the product that only I, it seemed, could produce. I met many of the men in the court when they asked me to design torture systems for them. I always agreed, as no one had ever told me I should not, nor did my written contract state that I could not. I always ensured that these plans did not include any of the elements I had included in the Shah's plans, as I did not want these courtiers to take the Shah's secrets and use them to figure out how to beat the Shah's systems. Every noble in the land purchased at least one blueprint from me, with an eye to installing it in their residence. They seemed to think nothing of laying their heads down to sleep mere rooms away from where their fellow humans died in agony. I began to acquire a healthy stockpile of tomans, the Persian currency, and I built several secret compartments into the walls of my room to safely contain them all. All my needs were provided for by the palace, so I never had any occasion to spend any of them. I had to laugh at some of the rumors that were the source of my newfound wealth, though. Some people said I built systems with magical properties, like flight or disintegration. Others said I had planned a system for every room in the new Mazenderan palace, and they tiptoed around, waiting for the palace itself to trap them. It became easy to discern those with a guilty conscience by the way they carefully placed their feet and checked the ceilings for traps. My favorite rumor was the one that I carried a lasso given to me by a Punjabi magician who had taught me the spell to go with it. The spell was to make it hang suspended in the air with the unfortunate victim dangling in its noose, until I gave the counterspell to allow it to fall to the floor. If I'd had such an item when dealing with the villain at the traveling fair, I thought, it certainly wouldn't have taken me 5 minutes to strangle him. I actually procured a lasso and began to practice throwing it around things in my spare time. The idea of possessing such a skill had a macabre attraction for me. I never spoke out to debunk any of these notions, preferring instead to watch and measure the impact of each new bit of nonsense on how people reacted to me. It was quite an amusing little hobby. It had been 3 years since I'd killed Miriam, and in that time I'd come up with hundreds of ways to maim and kill people. The poets in the court made up tales referencing the rosy hours of Mazendran, but for me, the rosiness they spoke of resembled more closely the crimson tint of blood. I had 2 more years to go in my royal contract, at which time I planned to finally leave Persia. Maybe then, I thought, I could get out from under the blood-soaked cloud that hung over me. I looked at my life one day and found it mostly tolerable. I was rich by the standards of my childhood. I fit in with the elegant men around me in manner and in dress. My command of the Persian language was adequate. I still found myself isolated from all womankind, but I decided that after what had happened to Miriam, I could not face the emotional toll of growing close to another woman. I swore myself to bachelorhood until the end of my contract, and resolutely averted my eyes from the women I had known so well during my years in the harem. Khadija would always curl her lip upward in disgust when she saw me, but I ignored her too. One day, a troupe of entertainers came to the palace. I was fascinated with the ventriloquist. He made a little purple-haired doll that sat on his lap talk. I knew that the voice had to come from the man himself, but I could not see any visible signs of him talking, and my ears insisted that the voice came from the doll. I cornered the man after the show, brought him back to my chamber, and demanded that he teach me how he did it. The man grinned as he made his voice come from each corner of the room in turn, and then made my stuffed monkey tell me a dirty joke. He told me the ways he held his body that enabled him to do it, but they did not work for me. I sadly assumed that it must be something one had a natural talent to do. But then he brought out a book that he said had helped him when he first sought to learn how to do it, and ceremoniously passed it to me. I was bound and determined to learn this skill. In the end, I succeeded. As I thought about the tips that the man had given me and connected them with what the text said about ventriloquy, my ability began to come into focus. I won't try to describe here what it is that I do to throw my voice around, because I simply can't. It's a process that one has to feel in their body and their vocal cords, not something that I can accurately commit to words. I suggest if you are interested in learning it, that you find a professional to guide you. Through all this time, I grew more friendly with Sarah. I chided myself for seeking him out for conversations, seeing the pattern I was falling into of growing close to people just because they spoke my language. But he continued to act as a good friend to me. I felt I owed him a debt, remembering how he had saved my life by getting me to design the torture system to win the Shah's pardon. I knew that the gruesomeness of my systems bothered him, so I always tidied my plans away off my desk when he came to visit me. My only other friend at the palace was Bass. He could always be counted on to stand patiently while I brushed him, listening with a friendly ear to all the complaints I had to vent from time to time. Sadly, he died in my 20th winter. He had been elderly when I'd taken him, and I thought he had lived a decent time span. I gave up riding rather than try to form a bond with one of the other palace horses, for I knew the end of my contract was approaching soon and I'd have to leave my new friend behind. One evening, Zara came to me in agitation. "The Shah requires your presence in the court. Now." I followed him briskly through the hallways, wondering apprehensively what awaited me in the court hall. The Shah was in a rage. My cousin and heir has been executed by a man who claims he ought to inherit my throne instead. I do not, and never will, allow anyone but myself to name who comes after me." I looked up at him from my kneeling position, not yet sure how this involved me. The question of the Shah's heir had been raging back and forth for nearly all the time I had lived there. He stopped before me. "My cousin was executed inside one of your systems. This traitor had it built to your specifications and then used it against me." I scrambled to find the courtly words of apology and regret in Persian. The Shah was so angry that he hadn't even bothered with his usual courtesy of switching to French for my benefit. It was considered unspeakably rude to speak to the Shah in a language he hadn't spoken to you first. He cut me off as I opened my mouth. "You are just as great a traitor as he is. How dare you enable this man to harm me and my line? I should have you put to death by your own handiwork. That would be fitting." He stormed away, musing about what he felt was a proper punishment for me. I finally found the words I was searching for. "I am sorry, my lord. I did not know that he would put my work to that use. I have always refused to build my systems for anyone but you. My contract did not prevent selling my designs to others, so I thought—" I blanched and recoiled as he stormed back toward me. "No, you didn't think," he hissed in my face. "You didn't think about how your work could endanger me here on my throne. That, in itself, is treason." Zara interjected. "Can we really expect a foreigner to be aware of the intrigue that simmers below the surface of our royal court, my lord? It may be rash to hold him to the same account as a man who grew up here in Persia, especially when he did follow his written contract." He bowed his head as the Shah whirled on him. "Careful, Daroga," he growled. "Defending a traitor is risky business." He stomped back to his throne and sat on it, staring brutally at the floor. Zara knelt by my side, still as a statue. I think he was afraid to move and called the Shah's attention back to himself. I know I certainly was. The Shah gave a great huff and pulled his attention back to his surroundings. His brow furrowed in dislike as he looked again at me. "The traitor is hereby sentenced to death. Execution will take place in the morning." I cast a panicked glance at the window. The sun was setting in the hurried fashion it does when one travels so far south. I had one night to live. I looked next at Zara, who had apparently opened his mouth to protest, but was wisely shutting it again as he read the Shah's mood. 2 guards advanced on me and lifted me off my knees. I didn't struggle against them. My mind wasn't consumed with regrets, but only with the promise of the morning. I had suddenly realized that in the morning I would be sent to join Miriam. My early experience at the church had taught me that there was an afterlife, and most people were reunited with their loved ones after they died. Maybe I'd get to meet my mother and ask her why she left me. Or I might even meet God and ask why he'd made my damned face look like this. The guards bore me down a different hallway than the one I'd taken to get to the main hall. They thrust me inside a cell that, while it was as new as the rest of the palace, had already acquired the requisite air of despair that marks a prison cell. I sank to the cot in the corner. Miriam's name rose to my lips, but I did not shout it. There was no need. I spoke quietly to the chilly air in the dungeon. "Miriam, I'm coming to you." I pulled the ragged blanket over myself and fell soundly asleep. I woke a short time later to the click of the key in the door. A lantern came into the cell, then a hand, then a person. It was Zara. "Oh, Zara, is he really going to make you take me to the executioner's block? That seems heartless." I knew he had a gentle heart, and I considered it cruel of the Shah to subject him to the spectacle of my execution. I was concerned for him much more than for myself. I held tightly to the memory of Miriam in my head, and it drove all my fear of my impending death away. No, Erik. I am here on a much different errand. I must place these manacles on your wrists, so. He snapped 2 cuffs on my wrists and took my shoulder to steer me out of the cell. I preceded him through the dark corridors. We met no one. He steered me through the maze of the palace until we got to a door I had never seen before. My internal compass told me that this had to be the exterior wall of the palace. Zara produced 2 keys. One unlocked the manacles around my wrists, and the other unlocked the door before us. He opened it on the short stretch of dark desert that surrounded the palace, on the other side of which lay the chaos of Tehran, temporarily subdued in sleep. The guards on the wall above have been rerouted, so this stretch of wall is unmonitored right now. Proceed directly across the open space and lose yourself in the city. Be at the city gates by daybreak, waiting to leave when the city guards open them. Stay in the desert and travel by night until you reach Shalu, due north of here, over the mountains. From there, you should be able to purchase passage across the Caspian Sea. I will lead the pursuit, but I will look for you in Khoi first. He unslung a bag from his shoulder and gave it to me. He lifted the hooded cloak from his shoulders and placed it about mine, hiding my form and my distinctive mask from view. Here are some of your possessions and provisions for your journey. May Allah guide and bless you as you go. I surprised myself then by flinging my arms around him and hugging him tightly for an instant. He didn't have time to hug me back even if he'd wanted to, as I retreated awkwardly away from him. I shouldered the bag and turned to go out the door, thanking him as I did so. But he wasn't finished. Erik, promise me one thing in return. No more murders. I opened my mouth, then shut it again in surprise. I had never considered the work I had done in quite that light. Was it murder when someone's life was forfeit because of the actions they had taken, the words they had uttered? I did not know. I shoved this question to the back of my mind for later consideration and promised him that I would not murder anyone. Then I slipped out the door and heard it close softly behind me.